Alright, ladies and gentlemen, last time I delved into the dreaded world of character design and it went okay, but if I want to get better, I'm going to have to just do it again. So this week I have a bit more time. I'm going to do not just one character, but four. I want to draw Gorgo, Amanitore, Gilgamesh, and Javayaman. All of them are characters from Civ, and I'm going to draw all of them hopefully in a fighting stance, as if they were in a fighting game. So let's start with Gorgo. Gorgo is pretty straightforward. She's tall, she's lean, she has a spear, so it's not exactly difficult to give her a fighting stance. So I'm actually just going to take her time lapse as an opportunity to explain what my workflow is. And then I'll move on to explaining what the difficulties were for each different character. I always start by drawing just some nodes for where the joints are. So that's the head, the shoulders, the elbows, the waist, the knees, and the feet. Basically, I place everything that can move, and that's a good way to define first the proportions of the character, because you're going to see we have very different proportions between Gorgo here, who's tall and lean, and Amanitore later, who's a lot smaller and a lot larger. And it's also a good way to nail the pose. If at this point, just by looking at the skeleton, you're not like convinced that like this is a real human with a real pose, it's not going to work later down the line. After that, I raise the size of my brush and activate the pressure sensitivity in the tablet options to give the skeleton some mass, to kind of build the meat on top of the skeleton. And so what I'm aiming for here is to have a silhouette, to have something that looks like what the final character should look like. That's probably the biggest part of it. If you have a silhouette and you have sort of a mental map of where things are, how big they are, how they should look like, then you basically have your character, and the only thing left to do is to just lay it down onto, well, not the paper, but onto the screen, I guess. After that, I move on to using a darker, actually the darkest shade of grey that I use in this palette, to outline the main detail that I want to keep from the reference. Now, in the case of Gorgo, because she's a pretty straightforward character, there is not much to remove. Like, I kept the dress, I kept the chain, but it's going to come in a bit more handy later on, and it was particularly handy with Hojo, who has a bit more of an intricate costume. For the shading, because like I said last time, I use a 2-bit color palette, so that's just 4 shades of grey, including the black and white that I'm already using. It's just a question of doing it in 2 layers. The first one where I'm just laying down 1 layer of shading to give everything some volume and nothing else, and then a second one where I add a bit more depth, but also especially texture. After that, it's just a question of adding color, so that's usually just using the bucket tool, but there's something pretty cool about the way Aseprite can handle color. You can have an indexed mode, and that's when instead of applying a color like an RGB value to your pixels, you apply an index, and that index refers to a specific color in your color palette. So if you change it in your color palette, it changes every pixel with that color in your drawing. I'm not going to have to do that in this one, but later down the line, where I'm going to work with characters with darker skin, it's going to come in handy. Alright, so on to Javayaman. He was a bit more tricky because he's not a warrior like Gorgo or like Hojo were. He doesn't have a spear or a sword or anything. He's more of a monk, so how do you give him a convincing pose? Again, he doesn't have much clothes. I purposefully picked characters that had some pretty varied body types, but also not that much clothing, so that I could focus on actually drawing the people themselves. What was a bit tricky with the silhouette here is that Javayaman has kind of a dad bod, but also kind of not. Like, he's not ripped like Gilgamesh, which I'm going to draw later, but he is also not chubby, right? He's a bit in between, so that was a bit tricky. One thing that's going to come up a lot, and that was definitely a problem here, is the faces. I struggled with it last time, partly because Hojo was facing directly into the camera, I guess, which does make things difficult, but also I'm just not very good at faces. And in the case of Javayaman, because he's bald and doesn't have really any kind of like jewelry or anything to grab the attention, you really want your face to be convincing. That's just not the case here, I'm fully aware of that, so I think that's going to have to be a focus of some later video. I also paid a bit extra attention to his skin color, like I said. I said last time I wasn't too happy with the skin color that I gave to Hojo, he was a bit too white, but I'm actually pretty happy with what I came up with here. Then I moved on to Amanitore, who was undoubtedly the most difficult one I've done, and she was not difficult for the reasons that I expected, right? I didn't have too much trouble with the fact that she's a bit larger. That was just, you know, something I had to look out for, but wasn't particularly difficult. No, the main problem was that if you look at the reference, she wears only one colour. Hojo had a pretty colourful attire actually, with some green, some blue, some brown. Gorgo and Jayavarman were wearing red and gold. Gilgamesh, which I haven't drawn yet but will draw later, wears blue and gold. You know, some pretty nice colours that go pretty nicely with the skin tone, but Amanita only wears gold. And everything about her is gold. Her collar is gold, her dress is gold, her scepter is gold, her earrings are gold. And in pixel art, where you don't really have much of an option to use texture as a way to differentiate things, it was a lot harder than I thought. And it's only way later, like way too late in the process, that I realized that was the problem. But I think if I had to do it again, I would try and simplify her attire and try to bring in some color somewhere. She also presented kind of the same difficulty as Jayavarman did. She's not bald, but she doesn't have much hair, and she has pretty subtle expression in the reference, one of contentment and also just kind of sassy, and it was, yeah, difficult to carry across in pixel art. And part of that, I think, is I just didn't have that many colours. I restricted myself to 3 shades of brown. I think it was 4 for the other 2, and for a face, that's just not enough. A face is a bit more complicated than that. And finally, I went on to Gilgamesh, and for him, I completely broke my rule of characters being between 30 and 50 pixels. I made him a bit taller than that. I'm not actually sure how many that is, probably 54, something like that, maybe 55. And he was very fun to draw. I expected the beard and the you know, the sheer bulkiness of the character to be a bit difficult, but not that much, honestly. It was a bit difficult getting the proportions right. I made him a bit too short at first, but it was an easy fix, to be honest. And the sheer size of him meant that I could add a lot more detail than I probably could have with any other sprite. So I didn't expect to be able to keep the massive colour he has here, and I didn't keep it in its entirety, obviously, but I managed to keep the central one and just gave it kind of a leather thing around him instead of the full gold thing. Alright, so that's the 4 time lapses done. Let's look at the results. Alright, so that's the finished product. I had a bit of fun with the UI, the presentation. It should look a bit better than the one I'd made last week, which was a bit rushed. I do think this was a really useful exercise. I'm definitely a bit more comfortable right now with character drawing, at least in pixel art, than I was before. So, like I said, I am going to have to work on my faces. I just saw that one of you has given me some really cool recommendations in the comments of my last video. I'll definitely keep that in mind for next time. So big thank you to Wimpy the 3, Wimpy the 3rd, for the recommendation and for the support these last few weeks. I really appreciate it. That's going to have to be it for this week though. I think I'm going to come back to environments next week. I'm a bit tired of drawing characters. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. I'll be back next week. Take care. Bye bye.